So now it's my pleasure to introduce Zannah Crowe. I recently found a collection of garden quotes from a vintage Ortho Garden Digest publication. And when I read the following, I thought, yeah, that really sums it up. It's attributed to Marie Houston, and she is quoted as saying, quote, "The garden season officially begins on January 1st and ends on December 31st. So as gardeners, we want to be able to enjoy our garden space and our garden experiences all year round. And Zannah's going to use her expertise and her experience to help us stroll through the seasons from January 1st to December 31st in our gardens. She is a professional horticulturist with over 35 years of experience in the green industry. She's currently the educational horticulturist at Johnson's Gardens in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. She does many things there, but assists gardeners with plant selection, care advice for landscape plants, container plantings, house plants. She's presented programs for Old Brick Botanical Gardens, the Milwaukee Art Museum, Garden Expo, the Berner Botanical Gardens, and many others. If you check out her website, you will also find out that she's a talented photographer and artist. And I think we will see the artist eye as we see her presentation today. So thank you, Zannah, for joining us today and sharing Creating a Garden of Four-Season Interest. So I'll hand it off to Zannah.
And okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Artist, for that nice introduction. To everybody that's joining us today, it's wonderful to be here with you. Bear with me if we have any technological glitches. That's been the most anxiety-ridden part of this for me, and I'm hoping this all goes smoothly. But what Artist said is very, very true. You know, as gardeners, we are thinking about our gardens year-round. Certainly at this time of year, we are all looking at seed catalogs and that sort of thing. But we don't want to just spend the winter waiting for spring to arrive. So what I'm gonna do with you today is sort of walk through the gardens and think about some of the considerations for adding interest to your garden throughout the entire year and not necessarily just during the growing season. And you know, these are the things we're going to consider are form, texture, and color. And this is a black and white image of a garden during the winter months. And I intentionally pulled the color out of this image. So even though there are evergreens in this photograph, you can see how interesting and satisfying that landscape is even in the middle of winter, just with the form and texture. The first thing we think of when we think about interest for the winter months is evergreens. And that's sort of a natural first step. And there are many different forms and textures, you know, in the evergreens. On one side of the screen, we see the really dense growth of the dwarf Alberta spruce, and then the more loose, open growth of a white pine, and then sort of intermediate of the Black Hill spruce. But, whoops, go backwards, shoot. There we go. Sorry about that, this is what I meant. Okay, so, but there's lots of interest also in deciduous plants. There's a lot of beauty in the form of this weeping crabapple tree during the winter months. This is a plant called a Harry Lauder's walking stick, or a contorted filbert, that is actually more interesting and beautiful during the winter months than it is during the summer months because of this beautiful twisted form. It has very, very large green leaves that kind of camouflage that form during the summer. And even just the simplest of your deciduous shrubs can have interest during the winter months. The hydrangeas, when we leave their blossoms on them, add that winter interest, but even just the snow on the form of the stems. And the beautiful elegance and majesty of some of our native trees, like the oak trees. As you're driving, when I am driving down the highways in Wisconsin during the winter months, I'm always struck by the beauty of these oak trees during the winter months, their form. Bark is another consideration. The paper bark birch has this beautiful peeling bark. Many of the paper bark birches are unfortunately rather susceptible to damage from the bronze leaf borer, although there are some new introductions that are more resistant. But the river birch, which is a native birch, does have resistance to the bronze birch borer, and though it's a different sort of beauty, it still does add a lot of interest with its bark during the winter months. This is the bark of the paper bark maple, this beautiful red peeling bark. This is a plant called autumn lilac or seven sunflower. It has this peeling bark, and certainly you wouldn't grow a plant just for this feature. But as we look at the other seasons of the year, we're going to see this plant and some of these other ones, what they have to offer during the other seasons of the year as well. And you'll see that this, what they're offering during the winter months is just icing on the cake. This is our native nine bark. It's a native understory shrub, and it has this peeling bark. It takes its name from the fact that it was, thought to look as though it had 9 different types of bark. And again, we'll look at what this plant has to offer in other seasons as we get to those seasons. The beech tree, with its beautiful smooth bark that's sometimes compared to the skin of an elephant. The other thing that the beech tree offers is that it retains its tan leaves through much of the winter, so that adds winter interest. This is a plant that is sometimes a small tree. It's a native tree. It's sometimes called a blue beech because of its similarity in the bark to the beech. This is the musclewood, and you can see also where it gets that common name, where you once the plant is mature, you see that the ridges underneath the smooth bark that almost looks like muscles. Winter is a time for garden art to really shine. So your bench that you can look out on, even though you're not sitting on it, it's very peaceful to look out on a bench in the winter landscape. Any type of garden art can really shine in the winter months. Here's a scene that has a tremendous amount of interest at the height of winter. We've got your bench, we've got the weeping form of that weeping mulberry, we've got different forms of evergreens and different textures, we've got some perennials and grasses left standing, and we have some red fruit. And red can really be a very important color in the winter landscape, in any landscape for that matter. If you go to a museum or you look at art or photographs, you can really see what red does in an image, and it does the same thing in a landscape. So how can we bring red into the landscape? Well, here's a little bit of whimsy. If you have an outbuilding, you can paint red, or something as simple as a little birdhouse. But you can certainly bring red in through the plants in your landscape as well. Many of the crab apples now are bred to have retentive fruit, so that fruit remains on the plant through the winter months and adds a tremendous amount of winter interest. And you can cut the fruit and place it where you want. And also an excellent plant for bringing red into the winter landscape is the red twig dogwood. It's the new stems of the red twig dogwood that have the most brilliant red color. And so what you want to do to keep that brilliant red color is go in there every year and cut out 1/3 of the oldest stems. And so you'll be removing the ones that are becoming more brown, and then it'll encourage new, brighter red growth to come in. The best time to do this is in the winter months, sort of the late fall, early winter, And so that's ideal for those of us that want to decorate with these red cut stems, because you can add a lot of interest to your containers through the winter months with your cut red twig dogwood stems. You can even cheat and put them in the landscape. Before we established gardens around our sign out front, I actually used to cut red twig dogwood and put them in the ground as pseudo shrubs during the winter months. Ornamental grasses also offer a lot of winter interest. And we'll look at some of these in other seasons as we go forward. The sedum is something that many people can understand to leave standing during the winter months as interest in the perennial garden. But we really encourage leaving as many of your perennials standing over the winter months as possible, not only for the aesthetics of it, but also for the environmental benefits as seed sources for our native birds, and as protective habitat for our native beneficial insects. So you can leave, we really encourage you to leave your perennials standing in the garden. Just a few images of the winter landscape. And then we come around to right about where we are now in the season when things begin to grow. And I always encourage people to utilize the early season bulbs, what are called the minor bulbs. And they are not, in my opinion, minor because they have such oomph in our Wisconsin gardens when we're so ready to see things happening, in March and April. And these small bulbs really can add so much to the garden, give us a whole additional season of interest. Everyone's familiar with the crocus, but there are many, many more of these early season minor bulbs. The snowdrops or galanthus, these have been blooming in my garden now for probably 3 weeks. They will come right up through the snow. Also blooming in my garden for about the last 2 to 3 weeks is the aranthus or winter aconite. The Chionodoxa or glory of the snow, these have not emerged yet, but they will be shortly and will often be seen blooming through the snow if we get a late snow. A couple more images of that. That's probably one of my very favorite bulbs. This is a striped squill or pushkinia. This is kind of interesting. You see it super early. There it is with the aranthus or the winter aconite is coming towards sort of the end of its bloom, and the pushkinia is just beginning. What's interesting about this plant, at a distance it looks white, but when you get close to it, you'll see that it has these blue stripes on the stems. It also has blue pollen. It's one of the few plants that has blue pollen, and it's very, very fragrant. So if you're willing to get down on your hands and knees, you can smell the fragrance of that plant. This is Scilla siberica. There's some controversy about this plant. Some really believe it to be too aggressive. It will seed prolifically and create a blue carpet, as you see in the upper part of this image. But with all of these early season bulbs, they go dormant so quickly. As soon as they've completed their bloom season, they disappear underground. So I've actually grown that Scilla in woodland gardens with a lot of native woodland plants without it interfering with their growth. This is one of the things I love about the early season bulbs, is making these little bouquets to bring in and enjoy in the house first thing in the spring. There's a tremendous range of daffodils, some of which will come up extremely early in the spring. Here you see them coming up through the snow, and here you see them overlapping in bloom with that early Scilla siberica. But there are hundreds of different varieties of daffodils. So there's something for everyone. And the extra bonus with the daffodils, and with, for the most part, all of these minor bulbs, with the exception of the crocus, are really not eaten by deer or rabbits. Another image of some daffodils. And then there's the tulips, and tulips, everybody loves tulips. They don't tend to be a really long-lived landscape plant, but they're so wonderful as a cut flower, and they just have such traditional beauty. Everybody wants tulips, and they come in, you know, every shape and color you can imagine. However, this is the issue that we have with tulips. They are the absolute favorite of the deer, of the squirrels. We even have customers who tell us their dogs will dig up and eat the tulips. There is one exception to this. There may be others, but this is the one I know of, the tulip tarda. We sell this as the deer-proof tulip, and it tends to be, as a species tulip, more perennial and more reliable and long-lived than some of the hybrid tulips, and also resistant to damage by deer and rabbits. Looking at spring shrubs, and this is part of why we keep these things standing during the garden, during the winter months, is to supply, when our migrant birds come back here, what they are coming back for. You might wonder, why do these birds come back from southern climes up here to the cold weather again for the summer months? They come back because our environment provides the protein sources they need to feed their young. This is insects. And so we need to think about that as we're gardening. We have to realize insects are not our enemy in the garden. They're part of the ecosystem. We're going to be looking at plants, and I'm going to have a little indicator on here of their light conditions they like. So one of the very first shrubs to bloom in the spring is the forsythia. Back, the older varieties of forsythia, their bud hardiness was right on the edge of truly being bud hardy here. So if we had a really cold winter, the only part of the forsythia that would bloom would be the part that was underneath the snow and protected. So you'd see forsythia with just the very bottom part blooming. One thing that's happened over the past couple of decades is there's been breeding to increase the bud hardiness of forsythia. So the newer introductions are very hardy, and they're very reliable for blooming all along the length of the stem in the spring. Another very, very early bloomer is the cornelian cherry, or Cornus mas. Has these yellow flowers that will bloom right in the snow, as you see in that image. Later in the summer, they bear edible, really kind of interesting looking fruit that you see the image in the bottom of the screen there. Another very early blooming one is the oh my gosh, I can't remember its name. Here we go. But this is a super early red stems along the red blossoms along the stem before it leaves out. There are two strains that are especially hardy. The one is from Columbus, Wisconsin, and the other is a Minnesota strain. Some of the other strains are not as hardy, and they will not bloom as fully as these two strains. So when you're shopping for this plant, the red bud, thank you. When you're shopping for this plant, you'll want to look either for that Columbus strain or Minnesota strain. And then during the growing season, it has these beautiful heart-shaped leaves. It's really a lovely small scale tree that prefers partial shade. It's an understory tree. And the Amelanchier, there are many, many varieties of the serviceberry, all of which will have the beautiful white flowers in the spring. And they have many other features that are quite valuable too, that we'll see when we look at the other seasons. This is a plant called bladdernut. It is a native understory large shrub, something you might not be familiar with, but it has these interesting pendant flowers early in the season. And then really kind of unique inflated fruit later in the season. Everybody's familiar with lilacs, and these are a favorite of many people. Some of the old-fashioned ones, the heritage varieties that you see on the right side of the screen, they're very fragrant. The flowers are beautiful, but the plant itself can sometimes be a little bit loose and leggy, and that's where some of the dwarf forms come in, where they have a much more compact habit, like you see the Meyeri palaban. that can either be grown as a shrub form or grafted on a standard to be grown as a tree form. The flowers are just as fragrant. They're not quite as showy, but the plant itself, I think, it's a little easier to incorporate in the landscape because of its compact growth habit. This is a new introduction. This came out of our Johnson's Nursery selections. This is Mike Yanni's introduction. He was our head propagator for many years. This is called Violet Uprising, and he bred this to be a lilac that can be used as a hedge. In the leaf off season, you see the real vertical growth habit of this plant. It's absolutely loaded with these fragrant flowers in the spring. This is a new introduction. Last year was the first year it was on the market. Another one of the Johnson's Nursery selections is the Spice Island viburnum. This is a type of Korean spice viburnum. The Korean spice viburnum are grown for their extremely fragrant, sort of spicy, fragrant flowers. But again, many of the older varieties were kind of loose and open. They didn't bloom really heavily. And you can see the habit of this Spice Island, how tight and compact that growth is, and completely covered with flowers. It also offers spectacular fall color that we're going to see when we get to the fall images. This is another Johnson's Nursery introduction. This is Firebird Crabapple. And it has the white flowers in the spring, a nice compact head. But what it's bred for and why it's called Firebird is this retentive fruit that will stay on the plant through the winter months. It actually stays all the way to the spring. You see how the fruit and the buds and the fruit and the flower are happening at the same time on that tree. It does eventually drop that fruit, but it really adds a lot of winter interest. Annuals for the spring. Because we have these late frosts, we have to fight the temptation to put our annuals out too early. The one plant that can be counted on to bring us spring color is the pansy. We had a landscaper several years ago. He worked with a golf course, and he would always buy 30 or 40 flats of pansies, and he bought his 30 or 40 flats of pansies and he planted them at the golf course. Then we got this big blizzard and we thought, oh no, now Chuck is going to have to replant all those pansies. And he came in a few days later and we said, oh Chuck, you here to get more pansies? He said, no, the pansies are fine. They will last through the brutal spring weather that we can get. So pansies are the recommended spring annual. So plan your containers so that you can have some evergreens and some red twig dogwood in there over the winter months. Pull those out and put your pansies in for the spring, and then work into your summer annuals after we're truly frost free. Spring perennials. We're going to start by looking at perennials for the shade, because the way the life strategy that these plants have developed is they utilize that spring sun, so that some of these are actually full sun plants, but they've managed to arrange their life cycle so that they can utilize that spring sun and then go summer dormant. So that's the case with some of these, as it is with this, the Virginia bluebells. Very, very early. It's a large plant. It has these pink buds that open to sky blue flowers. Combines beautifully with the daffodils. And what I like about it is, even though it's fairly large, it goes into dormancy very quickly, so you don't have a long period of time when you have that unattractive yellow foliage. It seems to almost disappear overnight. This is Brunnera macrophylla. This is sometimes called the perennial forget-me-not. This one does not go dormant. You'll have that attractive foliage throughout the whole season. It has these forget-me-not-like flowers, but it is not a forget-me-not, so you don't have those concerns that you have with the true forget-me-not, which is now on the invasive species list. There are a number of different foliage forms of it. Here's one with the cream edge. And this is one that has, oh darn it, this is one that has silver variegation. This one's called Jack Frost. And I have noted on some of these slides, if these plants have been selected as the perennial plant of the year. The Perennial Plant Association is an organization of professional growers, and each year they elect and vote on a perennial to be selected as the perennial plant of the year. And what they are looking at is, number one, availability of the plant. What it has to offer over a long growing season, also what it has to offer over a wide geographic range, and hardiness and garden value. So I tell people that if you're just getting started with perennials, it's a really good place to start is to go to that Perennial Plant Association Perennial Plant of the Year list and pick your plants from there. Almost without exception, and they've kind of missed the boat on a few, but almost without exception, they're some of the best plants out there. And I will note on these slides the ones that have had that honor. This is the old-fashioned bleeding heart, Dicentra spectabilis, whose name has now been changed to Lamprocapnos spectabilis. This is a wonderful old-fashioned garden favorite. It will become almost shrub-like in proportions. Children love this plant. It does die down midsummer. It goes mid to late summer dormant. So you want to think about what you're going to do with that space when that plant dies down. There are other forms of it that I think are really worthwhile considering as well. This one is called Gold Heart, and it has this brilliant yellow foliage that I think really is stunning with the pink flowers, and here you see it combined with the mertensia and the blue flowers of the Virginia bluebells. And this is another one. This is called Valentine. And this one, the flowers are a more coral color rather than that sort of candy cane pink, and the foliage is a sort of bronze tone to it. This is Goat's Beard, Aruncus. There's a tall form that can get as high as about 5 feet high. And then there's a very dwarf form that makes a little lacy mound only about 6 to 8 inches tall. And then there are crosses between the two that are intermediate in height. They all have the white sort of lacy flowers, and the small ones have very nice fall foliage color as well. This is big root geranium. This is one of my very favorite plants for difficult shaded sites. This will grow essentially anywhere. It has a kind of a minty scent if you pinch the foliage, and that gives it, that makes it unattractive to deer and rabbits. It increases nicely, and it always just looks clean and tidy throughout the whole growing season. I love it as a shade ground cover. It does have a pink or, depending upon the variety, white flowers in the spring, followed by these seed heads. And you can see on that seed head, the shape sort of looks like a crane's bill, and that's why the perennial geraniums, a common name for the perennial geraniums, is crane's bill, and it comes from that shape of that seed head. In the lower part of the screen, you see the fall color on this plant. It really has quite spectacular fall color. Spring perennials for the sun. This is a lovely little native plant. It's called Geum triflorum, or prairie smoke. It has these nodding raspberry colored flowers very, very early in the spring, usually in April. And then the flowers turn into these sort of upward facing airy seed heads. And then as they age, the seed heads become more like what you see down in the bottom of the screen. And if you have a large planting of this, at that stage, they almost look like smoke, and that's why it's called prairie smoke. This is the Amsonia willow leaf blue star. This is a plant that almost grows like a shrub. It has a very clean habit. I really like it as kind of a backbone plant. The flowers are described usually as blue. They're not. They're almost like a silvery gray, but I like to combine them. And the reason I have the picture of the iris in here is I combine them with Siberian iris, because the blue in the Siberian iris sort of brings out the blue in those blue-gray flowers. And the other season that is of great interest with the Amsonia is autumn. And you see that picture on the lower part of the screen of the Amsonia in the autumn months going into winter. Quite a beautiful yellow-orange fall color. This is another form of Amsonia. This one is called blue ice, and this one is wonderful as a ground cover. It only gets about 10 to 12 inches tall, and the flower is a much richer blue than you see in the tall one. Just a really clean ground cover. Sort of slow to increase, but has a really nice look to it, and deer and rabbits do tend to leave it alone. This is a newer introduction. This one's called Storm Cloud. And what sets this one apart is you can see the stems are that dark, almost black color. A plant with sort of a similar growth habit to the Amsonia is the Baptisia. This is a Midwest prairie native, the false indigo it's called, because it was actually used as a substitute for indigo at one time. This one, again, was given the honor of being the perennial plant of the year in 2010. Wonderful, wonderful plant. The straight species was a good plant, but there's been a lot of improvement in breeding with the Baptisias. And what they've bred for is an increase in the number of colors that are available. But more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, is the number of blooms. The newer introductions tend to begin to bloom much younger and to bloom much more heavily. Peonies are an old-fashioned favorite. And now we move into summer. Summer perennials for the shade. We're going to start in the shade just because we started in the shade in the spring. And what you have to think about for shade perennial gardens is you're just not going to have that abundance of floral color that you're going to be able to achieve in the sunny garden. So here we're thinking again about texture and form and color, but in not necessarily flower color. There's tremendous amount of variation in hostas, everything from the tiniest little hosta you see in the upper part of the screen. For those of you who are too young to remember film cameras, that is a film canister there for scale. And then all the way to these very large ones that you see below. There's the largest one in the market is probably the one called Empress Wu that can get as much as 6 feet across when it's mature. Just all kinds of different foliages that are offered in the hostas. Also, all hostas do bloom. Many gardeners will actually just cut the flowers off, some of the varieties that aren't particularly showy in bloom, but some of them have been bred to have beautiful flowers in addition to beautiful foliage. And one of our favorites that we have in our gardens here is called Fragrant Bouquet, almost like a lily, very fragrant, very pretty. There are some bulbs, we saw those early season bulbs. There are some later season bulbs that'll bloom into June, and these will grow in partial shade. This one is a Pacific Southwest native, but it's perfectly hardy to the Midwest. It's called Camassia. Used a lot in European gardens, not seen very much in American gardens, and it should be. This is flowering onion or the allium. There are many, many different types. Being part of the onion family, the deer tend to leave them alone, so that's a plus. There are many different forms. This is Allium Christophii, called Star of Persia. This one blooms as late as July. This is Allium ceruleum. The flowers are only about the size of a quarter, so it's small, but it has this true blue color that is so rarely seen in the garden. And I love the seed heads of allium as well, and I do like to leave them standing in the garden. You can do funny things like paint the seed heads. I do this in our gardens and it gets a lot of attention. This is how you do it. You just put some sort of a piece of paper or something with a slit in it underneath and you spray paint them. And I spray paint my allium seed heads every year. And my husband, who's a landscape architect, last year said to me, boy, those alliums are really holding up and looking beautiful in the garden for a long time this year. So you can paint them the color of their natural flower and they can look like they're blooming a lot longer. This is a bulb that used to be classified as an allium. It's been reclassified now, but it has these really unusual pendant flowers. And here you see it being visited by a hummingbird. I always like to have a few things in the garden that garden visitors might not recognize, so that they can discover something new in visiting your garden. And this is one of those plants that's really underutilized. And I really like it. This is watching it progress through its bloom cycle. It starts out with like a papery covering and very upright face, sort of arrow-like flower. And then as the flower matures, it becomes more pendant and eventually ends up being like this candelabra effect. And I love to use them in floral arrangements. This is leucojum. This is, sometimes people will call this giant snowflake. It looks in a way like that, the snowdrop that started the season off, but this blooms in June and it's much larger. It stands about 18 inches tall, but I just love these pendant white flowers. But moving beyond flowers, there's so much to be offered just in the foliage of some of these plants for our shade garden. Here we see the lady's mantle combined with the Japanese painted fern. Again, Japanese painted fern was named Perennial Plant of the Year, and it's a wonderful plant. One that I like even more, though, than the Japanese painted fern is the one called Ghost. And what they did with the Ghost fern is they crossed the Japanese painted fern with the more vigorous lady fern. And so they got some of that color from the Japanese painted fern. It's not as rich a color. It's more of a sort of subtle silvery gray color, but you get the vigor of the lady fern. So it sort of has the best of both parents. Maidenhair fern, this is another native that has a totally different form than the others. It's very horizontal in its branching. And the ostrich fern, which I just love when it's unfurling in the spring. This is an aggressive grower, so you have to consider your placement with care because it will colonize areas. I've given over one area of my garden to the ostrich fern. I have a walkway on one side of it, house on the other side of it. And when it makes its way beyond its confines, I simply dig those. And what I do with them actually is I pot them up and I grow them in pots on the deck. They actually make a nice, summer interest for a container plant. Annuals, you can use, if you want flowers in your shade garden all summer, you're going to have to utilize annuals. And there are a lot of annuals that will give you all summer flower in the shade garden. So that's where you want to look if you're really looking for flowers for the summer. And also there's many annuals for the shade that have very interesting foliage, such as, here's a pot of all different types of coleus. Summer perennials for the sun. Well, there are so many. It's just a riot of color during the summer in the sun perennial garden. So I can't talk about all or most or even many of the plants that are going to bloom in the summer garden. But I'm going to talk about some of my favorites. This is allium summer beauty. I have a weakness for the alliums. The fact that they are resistant to damage by deer and rabbits is huge. Also, they're really beloved by pollinators, and they just have a nice, clean form to them. This one is called Summer Beauty. This is one that's a little bit dwarfer in habit. It's called Summer Peekaboo because the flowers sort of peek out from the foliage rather than being held above the foliage. This one is Allium Millennium. This one was the Perennial Plant Association Plant of the Year in 2018. You can see the color is a little bit richer red color, more than that lavender color that you see with the others. Stachys humolo, another one of my very favorite plants, and this one was named Perennial Plant of the Year in 2019. Really clean habit, not eaten by the deer and rabbits, that nice vertical flower form. There are other varieties of it, one called Pink Cotton Candy that was developed at the Chicago Botanic Garden. That is a bicolor pink that I like very much also. And the Stachys minima, this is very, very dense flowering, and it only gets maximum maybe 3 to 4 inches in height. So it's really cute for the rock garden or the front of the border. This is Leucanthemum Becky, a Shasta daisy, again named by the Perennial Plant Association as Plant of the Year in 2003. There have been newer introductions that are probably superior yet to Becky, but Becky was such a huge improvement over the older varieties of Shastas, such as Alaska, in that it bloomed much more heavily and much longer. So it really is a spectacular plant, as are some of the ones that have followed. This is Nepeta, Walker's Low and Junior Walker. So Walker's Low is not called Walker's Low because it's actually low, because it does grow up to, it can get as high as about 24 inches tall. Junior Walker is a little bit lower growing one. These are very, very long blooming plants. They essentially bloom all season. They do tend to get a little rough looking about midsummer, but if you go in and give them a good shearing at the time they start to look sort of less than ideal, they'll come back with a new flush of bloom and basically bloom all summer. Pollinators love them. This is a new introduction called Cat's Pajamas. This was all the rage last year. We could not keep up with demand. You can see it's a little bit more compact in its growth. It's lower and it begins blooming earlier, and it blooms extremely dense with these flowers. There are many types of salvia. This is my favorite one, Salvia caradana. What I like about the caradana is it's got a little bit darker flower color. It has just a suggestion of red in the flower, and the flower stems are a dark purple color, so that adds interest as well. As with the Nepeta, this plant will have an early summer bloom, and then sort of doesn't look its best. And if you don't shear it back, some of the older varieties at least will sort of bird nest out and fall open, and that's what's made salvia fall into disfavor with some gardeners. But all you need to do is go in there after that initial bloom and cut that plant essentially down to the ground, and it will regrow in a nice tidy mound, and it will bloom again. Also not eaten by deer and rabbits. Echinacea pallida. This is our native prairie echinacea. It has the more pendant petals that you see. This is a favorite of pollinators, and the seed is eaten by our native birds. There are many, many, many new introductions of echinacea, probably dozens of new ones coming out every year. Some are more valuable for the garden than others. I always tend to take a sort of wait and see attitude, and some of these have really proven themselves over the years, but I don't always want to jump on the bandwagon of the newest introductions. I want to see how they really perform in the garden. One thing to have an awareness of is if you are gardening for pollinators, you want to stay away from the double forms as you see here, because it's the single forms where the pollinators can really access the nourishment that they need. This is a native plant that is wonderful for pollinators. This is called wild senna. It has this sort of, people say it looks like a sensitive fern. It has the very divided, interesting looking foliage, and it has yellow flowers, and it is just covered with pollinators when it's blooming. This is balloon flower. You can see how it gets its name. The bud looks like a balloon, and then it opens to that cup-like blue flower. This is an extremely reliable, long-lived perennial. Some of the older varieties were tall. They tended to kind of flop over. They needed to be pinched. The newer varieties, Sentimental Blue, and there are a couple other series, are very dwarf. They only get about 6 inches tall, and I suggest them as a substitute for the Campanula carpatica, or the sort of clips varieties that often are used at the front of the border. This will give you that same look, but it'll give you much better perenniality. And it's just a really great performer. One thing I do tell people though, when they buy this plant, is you need to know it's extremely late to break dormancy in the spring. So you don't think it's died and dig it up and throw it away, because oftentimes it doesn't break out of the ground until June. summer shrubs. There's been a tremendous amount of work done with shrub roses, so that these roses are now grown on their own rootstock, and they're bred to be much more hardy and disease and insect, well, not insect, I can't say that, but disease resistant and long blooming. Many of them really truly will bloom throughout the entire season. As I talk about these newer introductions and all the advances that have been made, I go back to this heritage variety. This is an heirloom variety, one of my very favorite roses. It's a French cultivar of the Rosa rugosa. The flowers are so fragrant, they smell like jasmine, and they bloom all summer, and then is followed by these really showy, large rose hips. But getting back to the newer introductions, for instance, this Easy Elegance series, and in particular this Cashmere Rose variety, this was just really a showstopper for me these last couple of years watching this plant. It looks like a hybrid tea, makes a beautiful cut flower, blooms all summer. The foliage stayed very good looking with minimal attention. Really a great plant, and there are a lot of new really good roses coming out. Another shrub that offers summer interest, this is the dappled willow, that can be grown either as a shrub or as a tree form. And what people will come into the garden center in the middle of summer and they'll say, what is this plant that's blooming over here? Because it almost looks, the very newest growth on it is a pink color, and then it ages to sort of a white and ultimately to green. But it gives the appearance of being in bloom, even though it's really just the foliage you're seeing. The smoke bush, another this is a dark colored plant that offers the dark velvety foliage in addition to these really interesting smoke-like flowers. The older varieties were too large for some smaller scale gardens, and there's been some newer introductions that are more dwarf. The nine barks. So we looked at the peeling bark of the nine barks during the winter months. And as I mentioned, you wouldn't grow it exclusively for that, but that's just the last thing that it has to offer in addition to all these other nice features. So they come in all different types of foliage colors, anything from this amber jubilee, you see, which is this sort of autumn colored. There's one called center glow, where the center of the leaf is sort of an orange color and the edge is dark. And then there are many varieties that have the dark colored foliage. These are cultivars of a native Wisconsin plant, so they're very well adapted to growing in our climate. And in addition, they have these flowers that the pollinators like, and they have this very interesting fruit structure as well. And this is a new introduction that we had for the first time last year that I thought was a lot of fun. It's called Raspberry Lemonade. And the foliage is brilliant yellow. And the flowers, you see the pink stamens that add interest to that flower. And then the fruit is this raspberry color, and that's where it gets its name. So it really is extremely showy throughout the growing season. Then it would have that peeling bark during the winter months. Weigela have been around for years, and a lot of people say, oh, you know, been there, done that. But again, new introductions. This new series, which is called Sonic Bloom, has really been a standout in my opinion. They were marketed as blooming throughout the entire summer. I had my doubts, but they absolutely do. They don't just have the spring bloom, they bloom fairly heavily throughout the entire summer months. Summer trees. I think what we enjoy most about trees during the summer is simply sitting in their shade. And summer annuals. Again, as with the perennials, there are so many annuals, I couldn't begin to talk about all of them, but I'm just going to mention some of my favorites. This is Verbena bonariensis. If you wanted to have the ultimate butterfly plant in your garden, this is it. Verbena bonariensis is, every time you look at it, it's going to have pollinators and butterflies on it. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant. The original species is quite tall, and it will grow Has very little in the way of foliage along the stem, and it has these purple balls on top, so it sort of can grow through other perennial, or through perennials, I should say. The Bonariensis, the tall one, seeds prolifically, which can either be a benefit or not, depending upon your position. The meteor shower, which is a dwarf introduction that only gets about knee high, is sterile. So that one will not seed, but it has all the other benefits of the tall one. Another one of my very favorite annuals is the Dahlia Mystic Illusion. This one has a dark, almost black foliage, and then these yellow, striking yellow flowers. Wonderful plant. Although we grow it as an annual here, it is a tuberous plant, so you can dig and overwinter that tuber. I do have some of these that I've had for many, many years. Petunias, there's been tremendous development in petunias, and my favorite series is this Vista series. The vigor on these things is unbelievable. They're perfect for hanging baskets or tall containers because they will trail down as much as 3 feet, blooming heavily all summer long. One of the weaknesses of them, and I love pink flowers, so this didn't bother me, but they really only came in various shades of pink. But there's a new introduction this year that's being called a blue. I haven't seen it, but I think it's probably like a blue lavender. And I think they will continue to try to extend the color range on this series. Great plants. Now moving into autumn. Autumn perennials for the shade. Interestingly, there's a lot of perennials that bloom in the shade in the spring. Then in the summer, it's kind of quiet in terms of blooming perennials, but when we get into autumn, we do start to see some of these shade perennials blooming again. This is obedient plant. It does not take its name from the fact that it is obedient in the garden, because the old-fashioned pink forms will send out huge runners, and can really be problematic in terms of spreading. It's called obedient plant because you can take one of those individual flowers and turn it to the side, and it stays turned to the side. However, there are new introductions, and one of which is shown here, this white one. That one's called Miss Manners, and that one is clump forming. It does not run around. Chelone hot lips. This is a cultivated form of a native plant. What I really like about the Chelone, it blooms very late, oftentimes in October. But you see how clean and pristine the foliage is, even that late in the season. It has kind of a glossy, leathery textured foliage, so that when that plant starts to bloom in the fall, it still looks attractive. This is Tricertus, or toad lily. This is one of the most spectacular flowers for the fall perennial garden. But a weakness of this one is that the foliage is so prone to slug damage. So this, you want to make sure and take care of that to protect the foliage from slugs through the growing season. So by the time you get these lovely orchid-like flowers in the fall, the appeal of it isn't destroyed by, the ragged looking foliage. Heuchera Autumn Bride. I love this heuchera. This is Heuchera villosa. It's a species. Very late fall blooming. This has been, the foliage is sort of a velvety green, not terribly interesting in and of itself, although not unattractive, but it gives you this late summer foamy flowers. Very, very nice. This has been crossed with Heuchera sanguinea to bring us a lot of the newer cultivars that are coming out with all these interesting foliage colors now. The Sweet Autumn Clematis. This is another plant, as with the Scilla we talked about earlier, that there's some controversy. Some people do believe it to be invasive, but it is such a valuable plant for bringing that late fall show in. It's just this, unlike other clematis that will have a large outward facing flower, usually during the summer months, this one blooms in the fall with masses of tiny fragrant flowers. Just really a lovely plant. Extremely vigorous, go 20 feet in a single season. Autumn perennials for the sun. When we think of mums, we usually think of the cushion mums that are sold as annuals in the fall, but there are true hardy mums. There were a number of them on the market that really behaved more like a fall blooming daisy. They had a taller stem and a daisy-like flower. They bloomed in the fall, but they were chrysanthemums. Now their names have been changed again. But my favorite in terms of trying to get that look of a traditional mum plant, the cushion mum plant, is this Mammoth series. The Mammoth series comes out of the University of Minnesota. It was bred for extreme cold hardiness, but it has the look of what we think of as that classic cushion mum, but it's truly a hardy plant. Does not need to be pinched to have that form. Just a really, really great series. So look for that. If you're looking for a true hardy mum, it's the Mammoth series is one of the best. Many types of asters are fall blooming. Again, very much a favorite late season food source for our butterflies and pollinators. My favorite is the aster October Skies. And the reason I love this one is because of its arching habit. A lot of the asters grow very strictly upright, and they tend to lose the leaves on the bottom of the stem, even if they're a very dwarf selection. So you kind of got a brown ankle thing going on. So you want to have something, and you have to plan to have something in front of them to sort of hide that look. But the October Skies arches all the way to the ground. So you get a total mound of beautiful lavender blue flowers, beautiful form. The hardy hibiscus, you just can't believe looking at these flowers. It's something that blooms like this is hardy in our Wisconsin gardens, but indeed they are. Again, like I mentioned with the balloon flower, I think so many times people plant these hardy hibiscus and then they say, oh, that lady at the garden center told me that was hardy, but I knew it couldn't possibly be, and they dig it out and throw it away because it hasn't shown us any sign of life and it's coming towards the middle of June. But you have to wait. It can be as late as the middle of June that these break dormancy. They truly are hardy here. This is the eupatorium, the Joe Pye weed. Our native Joe Pye weed can get very, very tall, 8 to 10 feet tall, a little too large for most people's gardens. But there have been, there's been breeding to bring them down in size. This one is called Gateway, and it's about 4 to 5 feet in height. There's one called Little Joe, one called Baby Joe that go as low as about 2 to 3 feet in height. Excellent for attracting butterflies to the autumn garden. And the solidago. A lot of people cringe when you start talking about goldenrods in the garden, but there are really only a couple of really badly behaved goldenrods, and there are actually many that are very nice. This is a cultivar called Fireworks, and you can see how it gets its name. It has the sort of the look of fireworks. Very, very late, and again, valuable as a late season nectar source for butterflies and pollinators. We looked at a couple of Amsonias in the spring. We looked at the Amsonia Tabernae Montana with its fall color, but this is probably my favorite one for foliage. This is a cross between the Tabernae Montana, the willow leaf blue star, and the threadleaf blue star. And you get the best of both parents again. The problem with the threadleaf blue star was, at least in our climate and our alkaline soils, it just wasn't often happy and didn't have a lot of vigor. So this way you get that thread-like foliage, but you get the vigor of the willow leaf, and it is a spectacular foliage plant, and in the autumn is really beautiful. It'll be yellow and gold and purple, and just a lovely plant. Leave room for it, it gets quite large. Back again with the ornamental grasses pluming up. There are various types of miscanthus that have the plumes that will sort of get cloud-like during the winter months, and they come in various types of foliage, variegation, that sort of thing. This is Chasmanthium latifolium, northern sea oats. This is a native grass. It can be a little bit of an aggressive seeder, so have that in mind if you're going to use it. But here's the progression of the seed heads, from the green to the brown to what it would look like in the winter months. These seed heads are popular with floral arrangers. They're really quite beautiful and unique. Another native grass, this is little blue stem. There have been the straight species has sort of a suggestion of blue in the foliage, but there's been breeding to select for plants that have a much more prominent blue color during the growing season, and also some that have much more prominent red in their fall foliage. It's really a beautiful plant. The other thing they've done with breeding this is breeding them to be a little bit more compact and sturdy. The straight species can sometimes get tall and lank and tend to fall over, and the newer selections are a little more compact and stay upright. Here's the seed heads of a miscanthus, autumn annuals. So be aware when you're buying mums that for the most part, when you're purchasing the cushion mums at the garden center, even though these will sometimes be labeled as hardy mums, that these are not truly considered perennials. That if you want a true perennial mum, talk to your knowledgeable garden center staff that can help you get that picked out. These can't be counted on. They will occasionally overwinter, but for the most part, we think of them as annuals. Other annuals that are popular in the fall, the ornamental peppers, the ornamental grasses. This is the non-hardy red pennisetum. And what I really like to utilize in my fall planters is the ornamental cabbage and kale. And the reason I love these is, as beautiful and impressive as the mums are, that's kind of fleeting. Their bloom season does not last terribly long, especially if we happen to get some warm weather. Then all the flowers will open at once. But the kale will last. You can have these in your autumn containers and they will look even more beautiful at Thanksgiving than they did at Halloween, because as the temperatures drop, you get more and more color in the foliage. I also like to incorporate some of the interesting pumpkins, gourds, and squash into the fall displays. Autumn shrubs. Probably the most popular are the hydrangeas. These are the paniculata types, the types that have the panicle or the sort of pyramid formed flowers. These are the ones that are most reliable in terms of blooming in our climate. There are many, many wonderful varieties. This one, Quickfire, the reason it's called Quickfire is it begins to bloom about a month earlier than the others, and it also quickly goes from white to red, and that's where the fire comes in. So this one will start blooming in July. Most of the others are August into September, and then the flowers continuing to add a lot of interest all the way through hard frost. So here's Quickfire progressing from the white to the red flower. It's a little bit more loose, open panicle than some of the other varieties. Limelight is this white one, starts out, it sort of has a suggestion of green and therefore the name. Vanilla strawberry starts out white and then ages to this strawberry color. Now, one weakness of these beautiful hydrangea paniculatas has been their size. A lot of people with smaller gardens say, I just can't accommodate that huge size. So the breeders have been bringing the size down. And a couple of years ago, they introduced this one, which is called Bobo. And it only gets about maximum 3 feet tall. And you see the density of those flowers. So it's just like an absolute white ball when it's blooming. Beautiful. But it didn't offer that transition so much to pink. It sort of transitioned to an antique rose and then to tan. And so they're working on that. And a brand new introduction this year is called Firelight Tidbit. And this one, again, very dwarf, and it ages to the pink that many of us like to see. The common witch hazel, this is very late blooming, actually begins to bloom after its leaves have fallen or at least turned brown. We saw the flowers of the amelanchier early in the season, the beautiful white flowers. This is what else it has to offer. Beautiful fall color, at least on this autumn brilliance cultivar, and many of them do, and also fruit that's popular with the birds. We saw the forsythia, which was one of the very first shrubs to bloom in the spring. Really striking fall color as well. We saw that Spice Island viburnum with that beautiful compact form and those spicy, fragrant white flowers. Look at the fall color on that. Another viburnum that has excellent fall color, Viburnum casinoides. And even something as routine as the spireas, you know, if you look at them sort of with a fresh eye, you can see what they have to offer. I mean, their fall colors are breathtaking. The staticorm sumac, of course, we know this from, you know, along the side of the roads, the beautiful clusters of red, a little too aggressive for most of us in our gardens. But if you have a naturalized area where you can grow this plant, very beautiful fall color. This is a selection called Tiger Eye, which has this really stunning yellow, finely divided foliage all season, and then it turns orange in the fall. You can see how I've successfully managed to grow it in my garden. I love it. It's completely surrounded by that brick patio and keeping it in check. This is the beautyberry. It sets fruit very, very late in the season. The variety that we carry is called early amethyst because it sets fruit at least early enough that we in our Wisconsin gardens can enjoy the show of this fruit. When people come in the autumn and they see this plant in the garden center, they frequently think that it's artificial fruit. They can't believe that something looks like that. It's very striking. This is the cranberry cotoneaster. Beautiful fall color, as well as this retentive red fruit that'll add winter interest. And moving into autumn trees. I'm over time here, so I'm going to speed through this. This is a sugar maple, our state tree. Of course, we all know that beautiful plant. The Freeman maple, which is a cross between the silver and the red, kind of again offering the best of both parents, beautiful red color. This is the Korean maple. For those of us that are a little hesitant to invest in a Japanese maple because of their, you know, being right on the edge of true hardiness here, the Korean maple is a really nice option. Perfectly hardy here and has beautiful, beautiful foliage. We saw that 7 sunflower or heptacodium, the peeling bark early on. Look at what it does in the fall. It's got these white flowers. This is why it's called autumn lilac. And then after the flowers, the pink calyxes almost make it look like it's blooming again. The Acer griseum that we saw, the beautiful red peeling bark, here it is with its fall color and the form you see during the growing season, a great small scale tree. Here's the fruit on that Firebird crab we saw. We saw the musclewood with its sort of smooth, muscly bark. Here's the fall color. Again, it's a small scale landscape tree, great underutilized plant. Katsura tree. This plant is very interesting in that it has this beautiful fall color, but it also emits a fragrance. It smells like spun sugar in the autumn time. And the larch or a tamarack, this is a deciduous conifer. So it looks like what we think of as an evergreen, but in the fall, the foliage turns yellow and drops, and then you'll have beautiful emerald new growth in the spring. And probably the most beautiful, in my opinion, of the fall plants is the ginkgo with this lovely fan-shaped golden foliage. And then we've come back around to winter, and that's what I have.